Hello, 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 and welcome to the Meishan Edge, where we highlight the unique advantages of the Meishan pig. I am Laura Jensen, the Association President for the American Meishan Breeders Association, and I have with me today the Head of Research. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Jonathan Kemmerer. I run Oddbird Farm in Northwest Missouri. I'm one of the handful of foundation breeders, and I also do a lot of research for the association.
Yeah, and I am super excited to share what you've got for us today. Y'all, if you haven't followed Jonathan, he has been a major force in digging into the information from China and all the research to understand how we can maximize the Meishan and create a bright future for it. And today, I think, will be a huge eye opener in how you could look at your program. We've got a couple other of our founding members and master breeders that are already using these things. So anyhow, we're calling this episode the 150-pound rule or the Meishan magic, and it's a couple different things there. So I'm here to ask questions, but Jonathan, if you want to take it away, let's go.
Sure. So the 150-pound rule, which our member breeder James Patton calls the Meishan magic, is one of the unique features of this pig. So their history in China, they basically would convert garden scraps into compost and pork. And so they developed a larger hindgut and digestive system that allows them to digest more fiber. But it's a little less simple than that. Because it has to do with the size of their digestive tract, it's not really something that takes off until they're a little bit older. So from the research I've seen, when they're young weaned piglets, while a commercial type piglet you wouldn't feed more than 5% fiber, I think you can get up to like 7 or 8% with the Meishan, but it's not very much different from a commercial pig. However, once they hit around 150 pounds, then you can up it to like 20 and 25% without really changing their rate of growth.
That's huge.
It's not that simple. It does matter what kind of fiber it is, soluble versus insoluble fiber. So soluble fiber is fiber that becomes mucousy when it's wet. You see that in like oats, chia seed, flax seed, if you've ever made those at home. As far as feed sources, this is going to come from things like wheat middlings, dry distiller grains. The insoluble fiber is going to be things like soybean hulls, typically, a more fibrous cellulose type roughage.
All right.
Um,
Could I
how
recap
that
for a
translates,
second?
yeah, go ahead.
That's a lot. So I'd like to kind of say what I think I'm hearing here because I think there's some
Sure.
great points in here, and you and I balance each other so well with the technical side, and the farmer over here.
Yeah.
So you're saying that this was something in the Meishan that developed over time, that essentially um, the farmers in China that started with these pigs liked what they saw in the conversion of the pigs that they fed the scraps to, and they bred for that, and now we're living that result now. Is that part of this?
Yeah, basically, I mean, this was, they didn't have a ton of resources. These pigs were not raised in a commercial setting. If you look at the video I made on the AMBA YouTube, History of Pigs in China, even to the 1980s, 1990s, at the point these pigs were imported, most of the pork in China was produced by small producers that didn't raise more than a few pigs a year. And what's interesting is I cite in that video this like 370-page document from the 1970s that was made by American horticulturalists that were interested in vegetable growing. But pig production was so tied to the vegetable production that they actually wrote a lot about the pigs
Oh,
because that was where all of their fertility came from.
interesting. So then you take that to today,
Hmm.
and I know we're talking about kind of the Meishan and what's different and the commodity side. So I got a little lost on the fiber amount. So early on, you said 7 to 8% fiber is about what you want to do when you're starting the pigs out.
I mean, I don't know what's optimal, but you definitely don't want to go above that. And I guess the point I was trying to make is that with young pigs, they're not very different from commercial pigs, but as they get older, that ability to digest fiber, that's where they start to pull away from your more commercial breeds.
Okay. All right. So and that's on the fiber side of it, and then um, it really, I know distiller's grain is something that I think it's a hot topic in pigs and has been in
Yeah.
the, how many years have I been doing this now? Uh, and I think originally with the Meishan, we didn't really see a huge value in feeding that. In fact, it could be counteractive in your
It can.
growth rate in doing that. But now you're saying that there's research out there that it's really about timing. It's not necessarily that it's bad, it's about when you feed it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so they will make better use of that as they get older, but there are a few issues with it. I mean, for one, it comes from corn. So if you're feeding non-GMO or organic, that's not going to meet your needs.
There are.
The other thing is, while it concentrates the fiber, it also concentrates the fat. So if you're trying to avoid omega-6 polyunsaturated fat, distiller grains is actually going to be worse than like feeding corn.
Ah, interesting.
And that can have issues not just with nutritional issues but also with quality issues because as you increase the polyunsaturated fat, you start getting like a kind of slimier, softer, mushier pork
Interesting.
fat. I mean,
Yeah. Okay. All right. Cool. Okay. So, thank you. That was very helpful. So now, where are we at now? What would be the next thing? We've started pigs out, and then where do we go
well,
from
so this timing is actually really coincidental. And we don't have a ton of research on this. It would be fun if we had more breeders that did this. But when you look at like feed conversion, we talked about this in the earlier podcast with feeding that like you shouldn't underfeed your baby pigs because they're not going to get too fat. You know, you can't overfeed piglets at a young age. And the benefit, well, for one, it's so that you don't stunt their growth, but the other is it's the best return that you'll ever get on feed
hmm
because, you know, it may only take 1 to 2 pounds for them to put on a pound of live weight growth.
hmm
However, as they start getting older, they start growing slower, and so it takes more and more feed to put on the same amount of growth. So,
hmm
when they're weaned piglets, they might only need 2.5 pounds to put on a pound of growth, but when they hit that 5 months, then you're talking 5 or 6 pounds, where you
hmm
have to pay, you have to buy 5 or 6 pounds of feed for them to put on a pound of growth.
hmm
So that's why it's because those two lines are crossing, right? Your feed efficiency is going way down, but your ability to forage is going way up.
hmm
And so economically, it just makes a lot of sense that when they hit that point, you try and find some sort of a cheaper, higher fiber. Because typically with feed, anything that's higher fiber, like the distiller's grains, like the soybean hulls, those tend to be a lot cheaper than buying, for example, corn or soybeans. Usually, the more nutritionally dense it is, the more expensive it is as feed. And so when you have these two lines crossed to where their efficiency goes down, but their ability to digest fiber goes up, it makes sense to start plugging in some higher fiber, cheaper feeds, which for a lot of us small farmers is going to be forage and
Yeah.
pasture.
I mean, I feel like this last minute and a half, people need to rewind it, and listen to it many many times. So to recap, there's just so much wisdom in that I pay for a higher feed, and that's where I get my results. And I guess I never really thought about it in terms like you said. And it's super interesting to say that there's a point that the Meishan could get by on a lesser feed. I've been on that one feed for the life of the hog for several years now. I paid $19 per 50 pounds, which is it's on the more expensive side.
Hmm.
So what you're essentially saying is there's this 150-pound rule that from weaning to 150 pounds, that's where I need to focus my premium feed because that's where I'm going to get the biggest return on the grow out or the weight gain versus what I'm feeding, which is a standard in a lot of other breeds. I know in the Meishan
Hmm.
we haven't really talked about it a whole lot, but I know that that's something that I think we should be looking at. So
Absolutely.
is that right? The 150-pound rule is where you pour it on, pour it on.
Yep, until they hit that size.
Okay.
In fact, I even have a separate pen. I have a separate pen for pigs that are younger than that and a separate pen for my market pigs that are older than that.
Yeah.
And there are a few things you can do as well with the younger pigs. I think we talked about this in the feeding podcast that we did, that all feed up to about 20% oats because they have a really beneficial starch that is basically a prebiotic. And most feeds, like we talked about, do have good probiotics for the pigs.
Hmm.
But feeding those probiotics can also, because it's with their digestion of fiber, that is actually like it's a gut microbiome thing. They're
Hmm.
not physically digesting it, the microbes in their gut are. So
Hmm.
anything that you can do to create a more beneficial microbiome with probiotics and prebiotics is going to help them digest more fiber when they get up to that 150 pounds.
On the way up to it or
Yep.
after?
Well, after it, they should have the culture going, and if they're eating enough fiber on pasture, they're going to continue feeding it.
All right, and I know like we looked at my feed and it has those pro and prebiotics both I think in it.
Mhm.
So in that case, I wouldn't need to add oats. Oats would be for somebody that's doing their own unique formula, maybe.
Well, I don't remember yours having the prebiotics. I think it has just the probiotics. So the probiotics are the living organisms themselves, which is
Hmm.
typically like a bacillus family organism. The prebiotics is food for the probiotics, and those are usually starches or like
Okay.
a soluble fiber.
All right. I don't have a feed tag. That's why I'm. Oh. I have two in the house. I have
Perfect.
one at my desk. Okay. That makes sense. I don't want to hold up the podcast for it, but yeah, I'm gonna read while
So
you're
it's going to be
talking.
like the
So
aspergillus or the,
there's aspergillus right there.
yep.
So I think ultimately what I'm asking for me, yeah, but for everybody listening, could you outline maybe a couple feed programs on that 150-pound rule? Somebody like me that's going to go buy I use Neutrina, at the store,
Mhm.
versus somebody that maybe is doing more of oats and maybe a pig mineral profile or things like that. Could
Okay.
you give us a couple examples?
Sure. I mean, at least as far as what I do is I basically just mix, a balanced 18% protein swine mix that has the correct minerals, has the correct prebiotics, and then I just mix in, up to 20% of it as oats, which I think most people should be able to find because oats are really commonly fed to horses.
Mm-hmm.
And so that you can find that at your local feed store pretty easily. I know Jeff Maddox, who's the head feed guy at Fertrell, he swears by feeding pigs oats because it is a natural preventative for parasites. That it sort of works like diatomaceous earth, like the texture of it is it I don't know specifically how it works, but it also helps prevent parasites, which, if you're trying to quickly and efficiently get those pigs to 150 pounds, is really important.
Yeah, because you don't want to feed the parasites. You were right, by the way, on my feed.
Oh, cool.
Uh, okay, so again, counterintuitive for me. You said an 18% feed plus oats, and
Well,
that's what.
because the oats are something around 14%, so if 20% of that, it's probably going to drop your protein a little bit lower than 18%.
Hmm. Interesting. All right, and then that's how you get them off to the best start. That's how you would get kind of the thickest, biggest, fastest growing hogs. Which, I mean, in the meat side, which y'all know that's primarily what I do. That's what it's about. How big, how fast.
Yep.
So that initial 150-pound window, um, yeah, I think I'm going to change my feed plan a little bit.
Well, it's, the sooner you get them there, the sooner you can start cutting back.
Yeah. How long do you think it takes to get them to 150 pounds? We know that developing an eye for what a pig weighs is just something that people have to develop over time right now.
Yeah.
So what would you say 150 pounds is about what in your
About
experience?
5 months.
5 months?
I think, with some of our bigger and quicker growing pigs, maybe you get there early, but that's one of those. It's kind of like why I feed high protein, is
Hmm.
like I want to err on the side of not stunting their growth
Hmm.
because once you stunt their growth, you don't come back from that.
That's
And that's
been my
that's why I
experience.
advocate that people feed those little pigs as much as they will eat. Is you can't overfeed them. You can't
Yeah.
waste feed in that scenario.
Yeah, it's been. I'm going to say rare. I honestly I don't know that I've looked at it a whole lot because I'm always about how much can I feed them. But yeah, so in your experience, it's not like a horse. You can't rebuild that muscle and that structure if they don't get enough nutrition in that first 5 months.
Well, I don't necessarily know about that, but I know that their food conversion will suffer and you won't bounce back from that. You know, like I was saying, you get up to 5 or 6 months and it's 5 pounds of feed to put on 1 pound of growth. If you stump them at a young age, that might take 7 or 8 pounds to put on a pound of growth instead of 5 pounds. And that's what you won't gain back is the better efficiency from, more adequate nutrition.
I'm comparing apples and oranges. I get that. You know, a lot of what I learned was with horses, and ultimately, I
Hmm.
think it is the same thing. It's about how much can you feed them to get them back there. It's just that horses aren't looked at as a meat conversion. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. All right, so you hit 5 months, you hit 150 pounds. Um, you say go with a cheaper feed. That worries me a little bit because there's some pretty rough feeds out there. So
Well, maybe a better way of saying that is you should look for alternatives that are less costly.
mhm.
Um, and what that's going to be is, you know, something with a little bit more soluble fiber, which for me is pasture.
Okay. All right. So what does your program look like at 5 months? What do you change from the oats and the 18%? What's the next pasture they go in on your farm?
So I have a pen that's about 6,000 square feet, and I'll
Hmm.
keep maybe up to 50 pigs in it. It
Hmm.
has, permanent shelters, automatic water, and that's where I bring their feed. And it is basically a dirt lot
Hmm.
because they're on it all the time. But
Hmm.
from there, I can give them access to like up to 15 acres of pasture. So that's a hog panel pen, and then I basically set up hot wire. And when it's time to move them to a different pasture, I shut the gate on them and open up a new one, and they just go out to the new pasture.
Okay.
And I think this system is a lot more efficient, um, and I think it's ultimately better for the pigs.
Hmm.
Because what I see a lot of people doing that I don't like is they're mimicking that, like, intensive rotational grazing or the mob grazing that you see with herbivores. And I think that's a little misguided for a couple reasons. For one, herbivores are very nomadic and pigs are not. And to me, especially this breed, it seems like the pigs like to have kind of a home base. The other thing is, I think it preserves your pasture more because they're only going out to pasture when they need to eat. And then they're spending a lot more time on that dirt lot, and that saves the rest of your pasture from getting beat up. The
Hmm.
other thing is that, pigs aren't herbivores. And so with that mob grazing, you're keeping your animals in a really tight space, which for cows is great because they'll mow everything down. But when you start restricting pigs, that's when you're encouraging them to root. And
Hmm.
so I find that giving them a lot more space discourages them from rooting. So, for example, I usually give about an acre for every 10 pigs.
Hmm.
And the other thing, and we can get into that, is like the maturity of the plants and what's out there. While I do graze them, I still do supplemental feed. Sometimes I'll give them as little as, half a pound per pig per day, but I think it's really good to supplemental feed them because it's a good way of monitoring their behavior. Because I think one of the tricks is kind of getting an eye for it. And I think I shared this with you. One of my favorite quotes is from one of the 1920s versions of the Morrison's Guide to Feed and Feeding that says, it's the eye of the farmer that fattens his cattle
Hmm.
in this case.
Absolutely.
And so getting an eye for the animals, getting an eye for the pasture, it's a very intuitive thing that just takes a little bit of time. But
Hmm.
for me, the supplemental feeding helps because if when I put them out on new pasture and I come to bring them corn, sometimes the pigs they just stay out there. Like they're not
Hmm.
that interested in it. But as they remove more and more of the stuff they like from pasture, it's like I'm getting out the ATV and I can see them running to the pen already just because they hear me coming out.
The
And so
feed
that
wagon.
tells you that they've kind of gone through everything that they want to eat out there.
Hmm.
And it's if you watch pigs eat hay, it's really interesting because they'll sort through and eat the leafy bits, and then they just won't eat the stemmy bits unless they're like absolutely starving, which you don't want to do. And
Hmm.
so I do, and this is me taking off my science hat and just talking as a farmer. From my intuition, it seems like they know what's good for them and they know what's, empty calories and fiber.
Hmm.
And so once they've gone through everything they want to eat on pasture, it's time to move them to a new pasture and then mow down all the big stuff. And that's great for the soil too, because now you're just mulching the space that they were on and adding more organic matter to it. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, that big fibrous stuff they're not going to eat, and it's not good for
Yeah.
them. It'll really stunt their growth.
I think one of the differences in the Meishan versus other breeds is that it's not a formula, in my opinion. It's
Mm-hmm.
everything that you just said, and I've had a lot of people over the years ask me, how much to feed, and I have learned how to say that. I've got one group that's on 3 pounds per day, but they're also on pasture. I've
Mm-hmm.
also learned from our conversations that it can't be the tall grass. You have to keep
Mm-hmm.
it cut. That they're just not going to eat it. So I love your explanation of developing the eye for the hog. That's what I've always done. If there's feed left over, well, I probably fed too much. If they're hangry, then they need more.
Yep.
And it's very much dependent on forage and what they have access to. And I've even seen it be seasonal. As
Yep.
our weather here in Georgia, in the fall, it seems like, before the cold weather's coming, the pigs always tell me they need more to eat. So I love that we do have some guidelines that we can use, but really listening to the animal and developing the eye is really where the good things are going to happen.
And err on the side of them having enough feed. I mean, I
Yes.
recommend for people that are doing this to not feed less. I mean, I will, like I said, I feed a little less, but to 2 to 3 pounds should be a minimum for. I mean, I've been doing this for what, going on 7 years. So I've been selectively breeding pigs that can do this for 7 years. And I've also been developing my pastures to have a lot more forages that they really like that have a higher nutritional value.
Yeah, yeah. We also have people that reach out that in the vein of health and what they're producing in a protein, they want it to be 100% rotational, like some of these models that can happen in the cow world.
Hmm.
And I always want to point out that pigs need grain. It doesn't really matter the breed, it doesn't really matter what's going on. It's simply the physiology of the pig that they're not really designed to go without it. And at this point, we don't have an alternative answer for the health of the pig to remove grain 100%. Do you
Yeah.
agree
I
with that?
mean, herbivores are really incredible. And
Hmm.
you know they can break down proteins to basic amino acids or to basic elements and build the specific amino acids they need. They can digest insoluble fiber that pigs cannot, so you
Hmm.
really can't transfer that model to a different species that has an entirely different digestive system.
Apples and oranges again, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. I never thought about it like that, but that is the very basic answer. It's herbivores versus omnivores and
Hmm.
what they're able to do.
Right.
All right, so you go to at that pasture that you're talking about that they've left the 5 months. Now they're in where they have this kind of hub and spoke type model. Is that where you finish them at, or is that a different place?
For the most part, I mean, I do have it separated off because sometimes I'll substitute Milo in place of corn in
Mm-hmm.
their feed just to further remove the polyunsaturated fat,
Okay.
which is just a preference thing. It's not something anyone has to do, but even then, they're still getting access to pasture because of, and we can go into this on a different podcast, but it improves the nutritional quality, the shelf stability. Getting more of their diet from pasture does a lot of things for meat quality and all the things I just mentioned,
Shelf stability on meat quality has got my attention 100%. I
especially if
think,
you're doing cures. It's great for
yeah,
charcuterie.
yeah, absolutely. I just want to step back and make sure that we're covering it for everybody listening. Um, this same pasture that we're talking about, that would be, the after 5 months to your finished weight. You say just find a good 14% feed and go with that. I mean, it will be less money with a lower protein, or what do
As
you
far as their
recommend?
supplemental feed,
Yeah, yeah, for the grain.
it's hard to say.
Okay,
That's a good rule of thumb, sticking with the 14, 16%.
okay.
I might do a little less than that, but I also have really, really high protein forages. So, I mean,
Okay.
that might even be something we should probably talk about is like, because that is one of my big pet peeves is they're like, well, I have X amount of acres of pasture. And my next question is, okay, but what's out there? It's like saying,
Yeah.
I feed my pig 3 pounds of grain per day. It's like,
Hmm.
well, what grains are you feeding them? What's the protein
Hmm.
percentage?
Yeah.
I don't like looking at pasture as this like unified singular
Hmm.
thing. It's
Hmm.
probably more varied than the grain that we're feeding pigs.
That's probably the second most question I get asked is how much pasture do they need, to supplement, and how much pasture do they need to not create a muddy area? And I can't answer it because their soil makeup is going to be different than mine.
Yep.
Their grass mixes, the what's on it. I can't. It's not a cookie cutter type thing.
The
It's something
climate
that
and
they
how
have to
quickly
experience.
stuff grows, and yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Exactly. All right, so 150-pound rule in Meishan magic. The magic happens, you think, at the 150 pounds? Talk to me some more about that. Let's make sure we've got that covered.
Right. So that's basically the point at which they can start digesting more fiber.
Okay.
And if you try and throw too much fiber at them earlier than that, it really stunts their growth.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, if you're older than that, you may be paying a lot more money for feed if you're not finding an alternative for them.
Couple things you can probably, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see my gears turning. So, um, when it comes to the pounds per day per pig,
Hmm.
that's a huge number. And getting to the finish line is something we're going to talk about in another podcast with real numbers, with our numbers. Um, but I hear in other breeds and large breed hogs, the Meishan's a medium sized breed, that they're feeding 5 pounds a day per pig. And what we've now uncovered and what we're now seeing is the Meishan needs a boost at first, but then you're backing down, and essentially I think the overview would be that for the life of the Meishan for a meat pig, that it's a overall less pounds per hog to grow and finish a Meishan than potentially other large breeds, or am I just in love with the Meishan and I don't get it?
I think that's that's a really complicated question. I think they have the potential to be, but I
Okay.
mean, for me that's the whole point of this particular episode is that
Uh-huh.
you have to do it right, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of factors. But I mean, if you remember the interview we did with Max, he was saying that like growth rate on the genetic side is directly tied to appetite. So a pig that has the
Yeah.
genetic ability to grow quicker is going to have a much bigger appetite.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me gets into like industrial model versus the small scale farm, which is going to be another podcast that will really dig into that
Mm-hmm.
basic thing. But it's, for me, it's like I'm not building a multi-million-dollar hog house,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't need to get my pigs off the land in, 5 months or whatever it is
Mm-hmm.
that they're trying to do.
Right, at all costs, or the cost of the land, or
Exactly. Like
things
my
like that.
startup cost was a lot less, so I don't need to turn it over as quick.
Yeah, so I think, looking at the history of the Meishan, we're in our ninth year now, which can you believe that?
Hmm.
Next year is the 10-year anniversary. I think we have probably drawn from what we knew from those commodity models, and that you got to feed them as much as you can per day to get to where you want to be. And I think that's been a deterrent for some people for the Meishan, that the grow out rate for weight and time is not a value that they can work with. But in
Right.
this scenario, there's a potential to say that maybe it's time to look at each program, each farm in a different point of view, different light. That maybe we're learning some things that will modify that. Would you agree with
Yeah.
that?
Well, I just think this is, their ability to digest fiber and the fact that we're not raising pigs in hog houses,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, necessitates just a different approach to feeding.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you feed a Meishan like a commercial pig, I think you're going to spend too much money feeding them and you're going to end up with like 3 inches of back fat. and that's going to be hard for most of us to deal with when we go to market and sell the hogs.
Yes, I would agree with that. And the Meishan doesn't need any help making fat. Commercial feed, commodity hog feed is more designed to add fat where they're so lean. So,
Well, and um, one of the benefits of fiber is that it stops them from storing as much of their fat from feed. So it prevents them from putting on too much fat in a certain
hmm
way.
yeah,
And again, that's something we'll get into later because it also improves the meat quality.
yeah. And this stuff is so interesting, y'all. Jonathan and I kind of wanted to talk about all of it now, but what we're feeling like is it's kind of intense. I think it's very technical, and I
And
think
there's
more.
so much ground to cover.
Yeah, that we're going to do this in smaller bites. So we're at the 30-minute mark today, and I hope that's been a little more consumable. And we've planted a lot of seed for thought. Kind of play on words there, I guess. On the Meishan Magic, Jonathan, do you think we've missed anything on this very first laying this out here at the 150 pounds?
Yeah, I really do want to cover forages with a little bit more specificity.
Okay.
Because like I said, it's my pet peeve that someone's like, I have this many acres.
Yes.
So I think you do need to consider what's growing on pasture. I find with pigs, it's good to have perennials just because they are a little more destructive than an herbivore,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's perennial grasses, alfalfa, trees, especially. It just helps the soil, basically.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things to consider about pigs, one of the benefits of them not being herbivores, is they don't suffer from bloat. So if you're familiar with like sheep and goats, like if they have too much alfalfa or fresh clover, that can kill them. That's
Mm-hmm.
not an issue with the pigs.
Yes.
And so what's great about that is that you can just forage them on things like alfalfa and clover, and you really should because they're higher protein and pigs need higher protein. Personally, I don't really want to get too much into specific species because I think that's going to be different depending on where you live. You know, we all have different growing zones, different climates. But in general, you want higher protein and lower fiber in your forages. And so that's something to look for in species, but that's actually really, really important when you consider the stage of growth of the individual plant. So when I was first starting, I found this really cool. It was a study, I want to say from University of Nebraska from like the 90s. But what they were doing was analyzing the forage value of weeds. And I actually use a lot of weeds as a part of my forage plan. I kind of tend little spots where I let them get really big and go to seed. And so the weeds that I like are things like lamb quarter, giant ragweed, and what people actually call pigweed, which is basically just a wild amaranth.
Mm-hmm.
So those are also good things to promote on your farm if you want basically free feed for the pigs, because they're there and they'll grow on their own. But what the study analyzed was how much it changes in feed value from basically its life cycle. And so when it's relatively young and tender and like shorter than knee high, you do have up to like 15 or so percent protein with relatively low fiber. But as it grows and gets more mature, it basically drops protein and starts gaining fiber. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I see with people foraging their pigs is they don't want to waste the money they've spent on seed, so they wait until it gets really, really big. And at that point, it's not actually very much of value to pigs.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, but as it gets bigger, loses protein, and gains fiber, it gets a more robust root system. So you're basically at that point just asking the pigs to root because the only value that plant has is in its roots.
Interesting.
So I typically don't graze anything that's much over like knee high. And that's why I mow a lot in general. And, after the pigs have been on a certain plot of land, is it just lets everything recover a lot quicker. You get to mulch the field that they're in, feed the soil some organic matter. But ultimately, I mean, think about it like, pigs are monogastric omnivores just like we are.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's kind of what I've done to develop my eye is I think about, you know, how would I feel eating this?
Mm-hmm.
So, think about like kale. That's why baby kale is so much better than some, big fibrous piece of kale
Right.
from a plant that went to seed.
Yeah.
You can kind of intuitively know which of those are going to be more appetizing for you. And you have to understand that the pigs are with us on that. They like their concentrated, high fat, high calorie, high protein foods just like we do.
Hmm. Uh, could we do a podcast on this? I know that like you're as busy as all the rest of us, so saying, can
Mhm.
you write this down? But would you be willing to discuss in detail when you're seeding and kind of time of year and what you're using? Uh, because I know there are a ton of people in the Meishan community that want this information, and my response is that we don't really have that information yet. What I hear
Sure.
is we have that information and we're starting to gather data from that information, and I think it would be incredibly helpful to a lot of members. Written or podcast, I'm kind of feeling like podcast might be easier for you, but what do you think about that?
I'd be happy to talk more about that. I mean, I don't have a lot of data on it exactly, and I feel like my approach is something that I've developed intuitively over the years of just like,
Sure.
you know, seeing what's growing where and what needs more added to it where. And like I said, it's all about the eye, observing what the pigs eat first and what they
Mm-hmm.
like to eat and
Mm-hmm.
what they stray away from or what they don't eat. And that's why that like supplemental feed is such a good tool, is
Mm-hmm.
that if I see them start getting really food aggressive, but there's still stuff out there growing, then I'm going to walk around the pasture a little bit and see what's out there that they didn't want to eat and what's out there that they did want to eat.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's so valuable. I always shy away from a cookie cutter response. That's not
Mhm.
the Maison. That's not where we are. But I still think, y'all all know that I feed grain and they have pasture and they do what they do. But what you're talking about, I, I need you to hold my hand a little bit and
Sure.
explain, the seeding thing and that sort of thing.
Yep.
And I think there's a lot of me's out there that just talking about your process and sharing how you do so I can figure out how to plug it in for me would be a huge help.
Absolutely. And
Okay.
one more, I think, important thing to consider, or like fun fact I want to share, is that an important consideration is that green feeds takes about 4 to 5 times as much weight and volume as grain does. So this comes from like a Dirk Van Loon's book, Small Scale Pig Farming or something like that from the 70s. But basically, if you're going to take a 16-pound mix of corn and soy
Uh-huh.
and you have a 16-pound blend of, clover and grass,
That would be the
for
grain.
every pound of grain you need to feed the pig, you need 4 to 5 pounds of the green feed. So if you're
Wow.
feeding 5 pounds a day to a pig, you need like 20 to 25 pounds a day of clover and ryegrass. And you also see this in that history of pigs video that I did for the AMBA. When you
Mm-hmm.
look at the tables of what they were actually feeding the pigs, all this stuff I talked about, they were doing. You see them feeding more concentrates to the young pigs. You see them not feeding as much roughage and green to the pigs until they get older. And in the finished diets, you see them feeding sometimes more than 15 or 20 pounds of the green feeds to the pigs.
Okay, and so I think that's what you're saying, but it doesn't really matter large breed hog or Maishon. That formula holds true. That
Correct.
5 to 15.
That's true for
Okay.
every pig.
Okay.
But I think that's important to remember when you're grazing pigs is that it may seem like there's a lot out there, especially if you're trying to predict how long you can keep that pasture before you have to move them.
Mm-hmm.
Consider that a good sized market pig is probably going to be eating somewhere in the neighborhood of 15, 20 pounds a day of forage, which is like double what a cow does. I think from the Morrison guides I was looking at, it's like if you take a 400-pound calf compared to like a 400-pound fat hog, or you take like a 90-pound lamb versus a 90-pound pig, on average the pig is consuming about twice as many calories
That's
in a
interesting.
day.
Super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Herbivore,
But that's
omnivore.
why they grow a lot quicker and have a much higher muscle percentage. You
Okay.
know, it has to
All
come
right.
from somewhere.
Makes sense. Yeah, laying it out like that, it makes perfect sense. I love that we're having these conversations. All right. A lot of things to digest here on our I can't say it. Y'all know what I'm saying. Is that everything, Jonathan? I feel
Yeah,
like my brain
I
is
mean,
kind
I
of,
think we have a lot more to get into in other episodes.
yeah, yeah.
But I think for today, that's a manageable amount of
Okay.
information.
All right. And y'all remember he's Oddbird Farm. I think oddbirdjonathan at
Hmm.
gmail.com. Did I remember that
Yep.
right? And you are location outside of Kansas City, Missouri?
Yep, just north of Kansas City, Missouri.
Yeah, and your stock, I think, has certainly got its own amazing reputation with your feed program and what you accomplish and what you do. So y'all reach out to him. You can reach out to me through the association in all the ways: social media, email at ambameishan@gmail.com. Also have Jensen Reserve, the retail store, and a few other things going on. So we appreciate you guys listening today very, very much. Be sure and subscribe and share and do all those things, because the more we can get this information out, not only does it help Meishan people and the Meishan pig, but it also helps the association. So we appreciate your support. We're always working hard at the association to bring value and information, knowledge, and skill on the Meishan Hog, and couldn't do it without you guys. We appreciate you, and we will see you on the next episode. Y'all have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.